Take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let me tell you a story.
I was standing 10 feet away from my wife when I decided our marriage was over. Not next month, not next week, that night. The decision had already been made. The suitcase was already packed. The plan was already in motion. All I had to do was walk back to the garage, load my bags into the truck, and leave. Have you ever been completely convinced about something, only to discover later that you were wrong? Not a little wrong. Completely wrong. The kind of wrong that makes you question every conclusion you thought was a fact. Because that's exactly what happened to me. And if you've ever watched a friendship fall apart, a family break apart, or a relationship suffer because two people stopped talking honestly to each other, then this story is for you. What happened that night taught me something I'll never forget. Sometimes the most dangerous lies aren't told by other people. Sometimes they're the stories we tell ourselves. Before we begin, do me a favor. Hit the like button, leave a comment below, and tell me where you're watching from. And if you enjoy powerful stories with real-life lessons, please subscribe because every like, comment, and subscription helps YouTube share stories like this with more people. Trust me, you'll want to stay until the end of this one, because the conversation I overheard that night changed my marriage, changed my future, and changed the way I look at love forever. It happened on a Thursday evening in Texas. The kind of evening that feels ordinary. The kind nobody remembers. At least that's what I thought. Traffic had been terrible. Work had been worse. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the sky was fading into darkness. The house looked exactly the same as it had every other evening. The porch light was on. The flower bed Linda had planted months earlier sat beneath the front window. Nothing looked different. Nothing warned me that my entire life was about to change. I sat inside my truck for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel. Not because I was tired, because I was trying to gather enough courage to leave. The strange thing is, I still loved my wife. That's what made everything hurt. People assume marriages end when love disappears. That wasn't true for us. Love was still there, buried beneath disappointment, hidden beneath silence, trapped beneath years of misunderstanding. For months, I'd been carrying a growing belief that Linda no longer wanted this marriage. I never had proof. Not really. Just little observations, little moments, little assumptions, each one building on the last, until eventually those assumptions became certainty, or what I believed was certainty. I finally opened the truck door. The warm Texas air hit my face. My stomach felt heavy, the kind of feeling people get before delivering bad news or receiving it. Inside the garage sat a suitcase. My suitcase, packed 3 nights earlier, hidden behind a stack of storage bins. I hadn't told anybody. Not my parents, not my coworkers, not my friends. Most importantly, not Linda. I had convinced myself there was no point. Why have a painful conversation if the outcome was already decided? At least that's what I kept telling myself. The garage door closed behind me. The sound echoed through the quiet space. For a second, I just stood there looking at the suitcase. Years of memories flashed through my mind. Our wedding day, road trips, movie nights, lazy Sunday mornings, the first apartment we shared, the promises we'd made, promises that now felt painfully distant. I reached for the suitcase handle, my fingers wrapped around it. This was it. One more trip into the house. Grab a few remaining things. Leave. Simple. At least it was supposed to be. The moment I opened the door leading from the garage into the house, I heard laughter. A lot of laughter. Women's voices. Music playing softly somewhere in the background. The sound instantly reminded me that Linda had mentioned a small gathering earlier that week. A few close friends. Food. Conversation. Nothing unusual. I had completely forgotten. Part of me considered turning around immediately. I didn't want explanations. I didn't want awkward conversations. I didn't want anyone asking questions. I just wanted to disappear quietly. So I stepped into the hallway and moved carefully toward the staircase. The voices floated from the living room. Everybody sounded relaxed, comfortable, happy. I remember thinking how strange that felt. The house sounded more alive than it had in months. I was halfway across the hallway when I heard somebody say my name. Kelvin. My feet stopped moving. Instantly. Without thinking. Without meaning to. Every muscle in my body tightened. The room suddenly felt smaller. Another voice spoke. I couldn't make out every word. Only pieces, fragments. Enough to know they were talking about me, about us, about my marriage. My heartbeat began pounding so hard I could hear it. I should have kept walking. I know that now. But I didn't. I stayed exactly where I was, listening, waiting. And that's when everything became even more confusing, because the tone wasn't what I expected. Nobody sounded angry. Nobody sounded judgmental. Nobody sounded like they were discussing a divorce. For several seconds there was silence, a long silence. The kind that usually appears when somebody is trying not to cry. Then I heard Linda's voice, soft, shaking, and immediately my chest tightened. I hadn't heard that kind of emotion in her voice for a very long time. One of her friends spoke carefully. "Girl, can I ask you something?" More silence. A deep breath. Then Linda answered, "Yeah." The friend hesitated. "Do you regret marrying him?" The question hit me like a punch. I closed my eyes. There it was. The answer I'd been expecting. The answer I'd spent months preparing myself to hear. Part of me wanted to leave before she responded. Part of me didn't. I stood frozen in that hallway, waiting, bracing myself, preparing for the worst. Linda didn't answer immediately. Several seconds passed. Seconds that felt much longer. Finally she spoke, and the words that came out of her mouth shattered every assumption I'd been carrying. "I still love my husband more than he knows." My breath caught. Everything inside me stopped. The hallway, the house, the noise, the fear, all of it. For a moment, I honestly thought I'd heard her wrong, because nothing about that answer matched the story I'd been telling myself. Nothing. And standing there in complete shock, I realized I was about to hear something that would force me to question everything I believed about my marriage. Welcome back to Mr. George Stories, where life's most powerful lessons come wrapped in unforgettable tales. If you're new to this family, thank you for joining us. Please hit the subscribe button, because it helps us share stories like this on YouTube. Now, let me take you back to where this story truly began. Long before the packed suitcase, long before the silence, long before I stood in that hallway listening to my wife defend a marriage I thought she wanted to escape. To understand what happened that night, you first need to understand how Kelvin and Linda fell in love. Texas has a way of teaching people what success is supposed to look like. Work hard, pay your bills, take care of your family, keep your word, handle your problems, move forward. Those lessons shaped Kelvin long before he ever met Linda, long before marriage, long before heartbreak, long before he found himself standing in a hallway, questioning everything he believed about the woman he loved. At 36 years old, most people who knew Kelvin would have described him as dependable, responsible, steady, the kind of man who showed up when he said he would, the kind of employee every company wanted, the kind of neighbor who helped move furniture without being asked twice. But very few people knew how deeply those habits had been built into him since childhood. Kelvin grew up in a small town outside Dallas, the kind of town where everybody knew each other, the kind of place where church parking lots filled up every Sunday morning, where high school football games felt like community events, where families often stayed in the same neighborhoods for generations. His parents weren't wealthy, far from it. His father spent most of his life working construction. The work was hard. The hours were long. Some evenings he came home covered in dust and too exhausted to do much more than eat dinner and watch television. Yet Kelvin never heard him complain. Not once. His mother worked part-time at a church office. She handled schedules, paperwork, and community programs. People respected her because she was always willing to help. If someone needed meals delivered after surgery, she organized it. If someone lost a family member, she showed up. If someone needed prayers, she listened. Together, his parents built a simple life. Not luxurious, not exciting, but stable. And in their home, stability mattered a lot. Growing up, Kelvin learned that responsibility came before comfort. Needs came before wants. Duty came before feelings. His father wasn't cold. He loved his family. Everybody knew that. But affection wasn't something he expressed with words very often. Love was demonstrated through action. Paying bills, fixing broken things, working overtime when necessary, making sacrifices. That was his language. That was how he communicated. Without realizing it, Kelvin adopted the same philosophy. One evening, when Kelvin was about 12 years old, he sat beside his father on the back porch after dinner. The sun was setting. The Texas heat was finally beginning to ease. His father had just finished another long week at work. For several minutes, neither of them said much. That wasn't unusual. Silence wasn't uncomfortable in their family. Finally, Kelvin asked a question. "Dad?" His father looked over. "Yeah? What makes somebody a good husband?" His father thought for a moment. Then he answered, "You take care of your family." Kelvin waited, expecting more. When nothing else came, he laughed. "That's it?" His father smiled slightly. "That's the biggest part. But what if that's not enough?" His father leaned back in his chair. "If you take care of your family every day, son, you'll already be doing more than most people." At 12 years old, the answer sounded wise. At 36, Kelvin still believed it. The problem was that life would eventually teach him something his father never learned. Providing matters, but it isn't everything. At the time, however, Kelvin couldn't see that lesson waiting ahead. As a teenager, he focused on goals: good grades, part-time jobs, saving money, planning for the future. While some of his friends spent weekends getting into trouble, Kelvin usually had a schedule: work, school, responsibilities. His parents appreciated that about him. Teachers appreciated it too. People trusted him. Trust became part of his identity. By the time he graduated high school, he already knew what kind of life he wanted. Not fame, not attention, not luxury. Stability, a career, a family, a home. The simple things. After graduation, he worked his way through college while juggling multiple jobs. The years weren't glamorous. There were plenty of sacrifices, late nights, early mornings, moments when he questioned whether all the effort was worth it. Yet he kept moving forward, because quitting had never been part of his mindset. Eventually, that determination helped him land a position with a transportation company outside Dallas. The opportunity wasn't perfect. The hours could be demanding. The workload could be stressful. Still, it offered something Kelvin valued deeply: a future. He threw himself into the work. Managers noticed. Coworkers noticed. Within a few years, he earned promotions, additional responsibilities, larger projects, better pay. Every achievement reinforced the same belief he had carried since childhood: work hard, provide, keep going. Success will follow. And for a while, that belief seemed completely true. The better his career became, the more confident he felt. He purchased a home, built savings, created the kind of financial security his parents never fully enjoyed. When he visited his hometown, relatives often talked about how proud they were of him. His father rarely praised people directly. That wasn't his style. But one afternoon, while helping Kelvin repair a fence behind the family house, he said something that stayed with him. "You've done well for yourself." Kelvin glanced over. His father continued hammering nails into the wood. Real well. Coming from him, those 3 words carried weight. More weight than lengthy speeches. Kelvin smiled. "Thanks." His father nodded once. Conversation over. That was how things worked between them. Simple, direct, understated. At the time, Kelvin believed he was building the perfect foundation for the future: financial stability, professional success, personal discipline. Everything appeared to be moving in the right direction. The only thing missing was someone to share it with, someone who could make the house feel like a home, someone who could make success feel meaningful. The funny thing about life is that sometimes the people who change everything appear when you aren't actively searching for them. That's exactly what happened to Kelvin. Because somewhere in Houston, a woman named Linda was living a completely different kind of life. A life filled with energy, family gatherings, community events, laughter, music, and enough warmth to challenge everything Kelvin thought he knew about relationships. Neither of them realized it yet, but their worlds were already moving toward each other, and when they finally met, neither one of them would ever be the same. While Kelvin was building a life centered around responsibility and structure, Linda was growing up in a world that felt completely different. If Kelvin's childhood had been quiet, Linda's was anything but. Her world was filled with voices, laughter, music, conversations that stretched long after meals ended, family members who showed up whether they were invited or not. Nobody stayed a stranger for very long. Linda grew up in Houston, surrounded by a large black family that believed life was meant to be shared. Birthdays became celebrations. Graduations became celebrations. Cookouts became celebrations. Sometimes people gathered for no reason at all except enjoying each other's company. Those moments shaped her. From a young age, she learned that relationships required attention. People mattered. Conversations mattered. Being present mattered. Her earliest memories often involved family gatherings, tables crowded with food, children running through backyards, adults talking over one another, music playing while somebody worked a grill nearby. The atmosphere always felt alive, not perfect. Every family had disagreements, but problems rarely remained hidden for long. People talked, people argued, people forgave, people moved forward. That environment taught Linda something powerful. Love was not something you assumed. Love was something you showed. When somebody was hurting, you called them. When somebody was struggling, you checked on them. When somebody seemed distant, you asked questions. Nobody simply sat back and hoped problems would fix themselves. Those lessons stayed with her. As she grew older, Linda developed a natural ability to connect with people. Strangers felt comfortable around her. Children trusted her. Older people opened up to her. Even difficult personalities often softened after spending a few minutes with her. Part of it came from genuine curiosity. Linda liked learning about people, their experiences, their dreams, their struggles. She listened carefully, and people noticed. One afternoon during college, a professor pulled her aside after class. "You have a gift." Linda laughed. "For what?" "Getting people to talk." She smiled. "I don't know about that." The professor shook his head. "No, you really do. Most people spend conversations waiting for their turn to speak. You actually listen." At the time, Linda didn't think much about it. But years later, that same ability would shape her career. After graduation, she accepted a position working in community outreach. The work wasn't glamorous. The pay wasn't extraordinary. Many people overlooked jobs like hers. Linda never did. Every day she helped connect families with resources, housing programs, educational opportunities, community services, support networks. The work could be emotionally demanding. There were difficult stories, hard situations, moments that stayed with her long after work ended. Yet she loved knowing her efforts helped people improve their lives. Her coworkers often joked that she made friends faster than anyone they'd ever met. The joke wasn't entirely wrong. Linda had a way of making people feel seen. She remembered details, remembered names, remembered stories. People appreciated that. One Friday afternoon after finishing a community event, a coworker laughed and shook her head. "I don't understand how you do it." Linda looked up. "Do what?" "Talk to everybody." Linda smiled. "Everybody has a story." "Not everybody. Most people." Her coworker laughed. "See? That's exactly what I mean." Linda laughed too. The conversation ended there, but the comment reflected something true. She genuinely enjoyed people, not because she needed attention, because she cared. That warmth became one of her defining qualities, the same quality that would eventually catch Kelvin's attention. Their first meeting happened when neither of them expected it. There was no dramatic setup, no extraordinary coincidence, no moment that felt like something from a movie. It happened during a community networking event near Dallas. Linda attended on behalf of a local outreach initiative. Kelvin attended representing his transportation company. Both expected a routine evening. Neither expected to meet somebody who would change their life. The event itself wasn't particularly memorable. People exchanged business cards, listened to presentations, made professional connections. For most attendees, it was simply another work function. For Kelvin and Linda, it became something much bigger. Kelvin first noticed her while waiting near a refreshment table. Not because she was trying to draw attention. Quite the opposite. She was talking with an elderly attendee who appeared lost and confused. Most people had walked past him. Linda stopped, asked if he needed help, spent several minutes assisting him. The interaction seemed small, yet Kelvin couldn't help watching. There was something genuine about it. No performance, no audience, just kindness. Later that evening, circumstances placed them near each other during a discussion session. The first conversation began simply. A question about one of the presentations, a comment about traffic, a shared laugh about how long some speakers had talked. Nothing remarkable, yet neither seemed eager to end the conversation. The more they talked, the easier it became. Kelvin appreciated her energy. Linda appreciated his calm confidence. Their personalities felt different without feeling incompatible. When Linda joked about accidentally getting lost on her way to the event, Kelvin laughed. "You live in Texas and still got lost?" She pointed at him. "First of all, Dallas roads are trying to confuse people." Kelvin smiled. "That's your defense?" "It's a good defense." "No, it isn't." Linda laughed. "Well, it's the one I'm using." The exchange lasted only seconds, yet both walked away smiling. Hours later, Kelvin realized he was still thinking about her. That surprised him. He wasn't usually the type to become interested so quickly. Yet something about Linda lingered. Her laugh, her confidence, her warmth. At the same time, Linda found herself thinking about him too. She liked how easy the conversation felt. No pressure, no pretending, no effort to impress. Just genuine connection. Neither of them knew it yet. But the brief interaction at that event would become the beginning of something neither had planned. Something that would eventually lead them toward marriage, toward happiness, toward mistakes, toward heartbreak, and ultimately toward the second chance neither realized they would one day need. The days following that networking event surprised both of them. Kelvin wasn't someone who normally spent much time thinking about first meetings. His life usually followed a predictable rhythm. Work, home, responsibilities, plans. Yet several days after meeting Linda, he still found himself remembering pieces of their conversation. The way she laughed, the way she spoke to people, the ease of their interaction. Most importantly, he remembered how comfortable he felt around her. That feeling wasn't common. Linda felt something similar. Over the years, she had met plenty of people. Some were charming, some were funny, some were successful, but very few made her feel genuinely relaxed. Kelvin did. There was no need to perform around him, no need to impress him, no need to fill every silence with conversation. Their first meeting had felt natural. That mattered. A week later, Kelvin finally gathered enough courage to call her. He spent nearly 10 minutes staring at his phone before dialing. The moment she answered, he felt slightly ridiculous. "Hello? It's Kelvin." A brief pause. Then Linda laughed. "I know who it is." He smiled, despite himself. "How? You think I save random numbers?" "Fair point." The conversation lasted nearly 40 minutes. Neither planned for it. Neither noticed how much time had passed. By the end of the call, Kelvin asked if she wanted to have dinner sometime. Linda didn't hesitate. "Sure." The answer came so quickly that it caught him off guard. That made her laugh again. "Was that too fast?" "A little." Sorry. No, don't apologize. So you're saying I should pretend to think about it? Maybe, Linda laughed. Too late now. Their first official date took place at a small restaurant outside Dallas. Nothing fancy. Neither of them cared much about expensive places. What mattered was the conversation. Hours passed effortlessly. Topics shifted naturally. Family, childhood memories, goals, embarrassing stories, funny experiences. The restaurant became less important than the person sitting across the table. At one point, Linda noticed something. You don't talk about yourself much. Kelvin looked up. I've been talking. No, she smiled. You answer questions. That's talking. It's not the same thing, he laughed. What's the difference? The difference is that I know your job title, but I still don't know your favorite movie. Kelvin shook his head. That's important? It tells me whether I can trust you. He laughed again. That became one of the things he appreciated most about her. She could turn ordinary conversations into something memorable. After that first date, another followed. Then another. Then another. Weeks became months. Their relationship developed naturally. There was no pressure, no games, no uncertainty about whether they enjoyed spending time together. The answer became obvious very quickly. They did. One of their favorite habits became taking road trips across Texas. Neither needed extravagant vacations. A tank of gas and a free weekend were often enough. Sometimes they drove to small towns neither had visited before. Sometimes they explored local restaurants. Sometimes they simply talked for hours while the miles passed beneath them. One Saturday morning they left before sunrise. The destination didn't matter. They just wanted to get away for a day. As the highway stretched ahead of them, music played softly through the speakers. Linda controlled the playlist. That decision immediately created conflict. Friendly conflict. You've played the same song 3 times. Linda glanced at him. No, I haven't. You absolutely have. I have not. Kelvin pointed toward the dashboard. Linda, what? It's literally playing again. She smiled. Because it's good. That's not how playlists work. It is when I'm in charge. Kelvin laughed and leaned back in his seat. You're impossible. You like me. Unfortunately for Kelvin, she was right. Those road trips became some of their happiest memories. Not because anything extraordinary happened. Because ordinary moments felt enjoyable together. The relationship continued growing stronger. Eventually came the moment both knew was unavoidable. Meeting each other's families. Kelvin met Linda's family first. Nothing in his childhood had prepared him for the experience. The moment he arrived, the house felt alive. People moved constantly. Conversations overlapped. Music played somewhere nearby. Somebody was cooking. Somebody else was laughing. Children ran through rooms. Family members appeared from every direction. Before he had been there 15 minutes, multiple relatives were already asking questions. Where did he grow up? What did he do for work? How did he meet Linda? Was he treating her well? At one point, Kelvin found himself answering questions from 3 different people simultaneously. Linda couldn't stop laughing. You okay? Kelvin looked around the crowded room. I think your family interviewed me. They like you. That's what liking me looks like? Linda smiled. It gets worse. The funny thing was that despite the overwhelming energy, Kelvin enjoyed himself. The warmth felt genuine. The affection felt genuine. The family welcomed him. Not immediately, not blindly, but sincerely. A few weeks later, Linda visited Kelvin's family. The contrast couldn't have been more noticeable. The atmosphere felt quieter, more reserved, more structured. Conversation happened at a slower pace. Nobody interrupted each other. Nobody spoke over each other. Nobody debated 3 different topics at the same time. Linda noticed the difference almost immediately. After dinner, she leaned toward Kelvin. Is everybody okay? He looked confused. What do you mean? They seem so quiet. Kelvin laughed. We're talking. Barely. We're having a conversation. Linda glanced around the table. "This is a conversation?" Kelvin laughed harder. His mother smiled. His father smiled too. For one of the few times that evening, the entire table laughed together. Those cultural differences never became obstacles. Instead, they became sources of humor and learning. Linda introduced Kelvin to traditions he had never experienced. Kelvin introduced Linda to routines and customs that felt completely different from her upbringing. Rather than pulling them apart, those differences brought curiosity into the relationship. Both remained willing to learn, willing to ask questions, willing to appreciate another perspective. That openness strengthened the foundation of their relationship. Months continued passing. The future began feeling increasingly clear. Friends noticed. Families noticed. Even complete strangers occasionally noticed. One evening during another road trip, Linda sat beside Kelvin watching the sunset paint the Texas sky. For a while neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable. Finally, Linda looked at him. "What?" Kelvin smiled. "You've been staring at me." "No, I haven't." "You have." She laughed. "Maybe a little." Kelvin reached for her hand. The gesture felt simple, yet meaningful. Neither said anything for several seconds. They didn't need to. Some emotions speak clearly without words. That moment stayed with Kelvin. The certainty, the peace, the feeling that he had found the person he wanted beside him for the rest of his life. Several months later, he made a decision. He was going to propose. Planning the proposal turned out to be far more stressful than he expected. Not because he doubted his feelings, because he wanted everything to feel right. The ring took weeks to choose. The location took even longer. The nerves became unbearable. On the day itself, he barely ate. Linda eventually noticed. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine." "You look nervous." "I'm not nervous." "You absolutely are." Kelvin laughed awkwardly. That only made her more suspicious. Later that evening, standing beneath an open Texas sky, he finally asked. The speech he planned disappeared almost immediately. The words came out imperfectly. Some sentences weren't what he intended to say. A few thoughts arrived out of order. None of it mattered, because the emotion was real. By the time he finished, Linda's eyes were already full of tears. "Yes?" she answered before he fully completed the question. Then she laughed. Crying and talking at the same time is difficult. Kelvin laughed too. Relief washed over him. The future suddenly felt real. The wedding took place the following year. Family members traveled from different parts of Texas. Friends gathered. Photos were taken. Memories were created. Laughter filled the celebration. The ceremony itself wasn't built around luxury. It was built around love. And for everyone watching, that love felt obvious. The way they looked at each other, the way they smiled, the way they listened, the way they seemed happiest when standing side by side. People left believing they would be together forever. Truthfully, Kelvin and Linda believed that too. The first years of marriage felt wonderful. Movie nights stretched late into the evening. Weekend adventures continued. Inside jokes multiplied. Small routines formed. Morning coffee together. Evening conversations. Sharing stories about work. Laughing about random moments from the day. The house gradually filled with memories. Every room seemed connected to a story, a celebration, a conversation, a shared experience. There was comfort in that. There was joy in that. More importantly, there was partnership. When one had a difficult day, the other listened. When one celebrated a success, the other celebrated too. Life wasn't perfect. No marriage is. But they felt united, like a team. Looking back later, both would realize something important. The strongest relationships are rarely built during dramatic moments. They are built during ordinary days, ordinary conversations, ordinary acts of kindness, ordinary choices to keep showing up for each other. At that stage of their marriage, Kelvin and Linda were still making those choices naturally. Neither realized how much life was about to change. Neither realized how quickly responsibilities could begin competing with connection. Neither realized that the very strengths which helped them build a life together would soon create challenges neither expected. Because just as their marriage was settling into a comfortable rhythm, a new opportunity appeared. An opportunity that would transform Kelvin's career, an opportunity that seemed like a blessing at first, and that opportunity would become the first step toward the distance neither of them saw coming. The first year of Kelvin and Linda's marriage felt almost effortless, not because life was perfect, because they faced life together. The partnership felt balanced. If Kelvin had a difficult day, Linda noticed. If Linda came home emotionally exhausted from work, Kelvin listened. They made time for each other naturally. Nothing had to be scheduled. Nothing felt forced. Dinner conversations stretched late into the evening. Weekend plans happened without much discussion. A simple trip to the grocery store could turn into laughter and conversation. The connection still felt easy. At the time, neither of them realized how valuable that season would become, because life was preparing to test them. The opportunity arrived on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Kelvin had just finished reviewing operational reports when his supervisor requested a meeting. At first, he assumed something was wrong. Unexpected meetings usually meant problems. Instead, he walked into the office and received news he never anticipated. The company wanted to promote him, not a small promotion, a major one. More responsibility, a larger team, regional oversight, a significant salary increase, the type of opportunity many people spend years chasing. For several moments, Kelvin simply sat there processing the information. His supervisor smiled. "You earned this." Kelvin nodded slowly. "Thank you." The words felt inadequate. The truth was that he had spent years working towards something like this. Long hours, extra projects, late nights, weekend assignments, sacrifices. Now those sacrifices appeared to be paying off. When he finally left the office, Linda was the first person he called. She answered immediately. "Hey," Kelvin smiled. "Are you busy?" "Depends. I got promoted." The silence lasted less than a second before excitement exploded through the phone. "What?" He laughed. "I got promoted," Linda practically shouted. "Kelvin!" People nearby turned toward him. He didn't care. Hearing her excitement made the moment feel even more meaningful. "When did this happen?" "Just now." "Oh my goodness." He could hear her smiling. "See?" "What?" "I told you all that hard work would pay off." Kelvin laughed. "You did?" "No. Seriously." Her voice softened. "I'm proud of you." Those words stayed with him, because he knew she meant them. That evening they celebrated together. Nothing extravagant. A nice dinner, a few photos, a lot of conversation. The future suddenly looked brighter. The additional income would provide opportunities neither had before. Home improvements, savings, financial security, possibilities. Both viewed the promotion as a blessing. In many ways, it was. What neither fully understood yet was that promotions rarely arrive alone. They bring expectations, pressure, responsibility, and often sacrifices. The first few months passed smoothly. The adjustment seemed manageable. Kelvin worked harder, but the changes felt temporary. At least, that's what he told himself. At least, that's what he told Linda. Then travel entered the picture. At first it happened occasionally. A trip here, a meeting there. Nothing dramatic. Linda remained supportive. She genuinely wanted him to succeed. Whenever he packed a suitcase for work, she encouraged him. Whenever he left town, she reminded him to be careful. Whenever he returned, she welcomed him home warmly. The marriage remained strong. The connection remained intact. For a while, the problem wasn't a single trip. The problem was what happened over time. The travel increased, then increased again. A 2-day trip became 3 days. 3 days became nearly a week. The schedule became unpredictable. 1 month turned into another. The pattern continued growing. Kelvin noticed the workload increasing, but he viewed it as evidence that leadership trusted him. More responsibility meant more opportunity. More opportunity meant more success. That logic made perfect sense to him. It was the same mindset he had carried since childhood. Work hard. Deliver results. Keep moving forward. The rewards will come. Meanwhile, Linda continued supporting him. She never complained during those early months. Not because she enjoyed the separation, because she believed the sacrifices served a purpose. One evening, while helping him prepare for another trip, she folded a shirt and placed it into his suitcase. "How long this time?" "3 days. That's not terrible." "No," Linda smiled. "See? You'll be back before you know it." Kelvin leaned over and kissed her forehead. "Thanks." "For what?" "For making this easier." She laughed softly. "I'm trying." At that moment, she truly believed the adjustment was temporary. A season, not a permanent reality. The same belief comforted Kelvin. Whenever guilt surfaced, he reminded himself of the bigger picture. This was for their future, for their stability, for the life they wanted to build. The reasoning sounded responsible, reasonable, even loving, and that made it difficult to question. As the months continued, the financial benefits became obvious. Their savings grew. Household stress decreased. Unexpected expenses became easier to manage. The promotion delivered exactly what it promised financially. Yet success often asks for payment in places people don't immediately notice. One evening, Linda sat alone in the living room while Kelvin answered work emails from the dining table. The television played quietly in the background. Neither paid attention to it. Linda glanced over. Kelvin's eyes remained locked on his laptop. Several minutes passed. Then several more. Finally, she smiled. "You know we're technically spending time together right now." Kelvin looked up. "What?" She pointed toward the laptop. "You've been staring at that thing for an hour." He glanced at the screen. "Sorry." "It's okay." But her smile faded a little faster than before. The moment seemed small, insignificant even. Neither argued. Neither felt hurt. Yet something subtle had changed. Moments like that started appearing more frequently. A dinner interrupted by a phone call. A movie paused because of an urgent email. A conversation shortened because Kelvin was tired. Each individual incident seemed harmless, easy to justify, easy to overlook. And that's exactly why they became dangerous. Neither saw them as warning signs. Not yet. The marriage still felt stable. They still loved each other. They still laughed together. They still planned for the future. From the outside, everything appeared healthy. Inside the relationship, however, tiny cracks had begun forming. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. Just small moments where connection quietly lost ground to responsibility. Neither Kelvin nor Linda realized it then. But those moments would eventually matter far more than either of them expected. The difficult thing about disappointment is that it rarely arrives all at once. Most of the time, it enters quietly, small enough to ignore, small enough to excuse, small enough to convince yourself it isn't really a problem. At first, that's exactly what happened with Kelvin and Linda. Neither woke up one morning feeling unhappy. Neither suddenly stopped loving the other. The affection remained. The commitment remained. The problem was that daily life had started pulling them in different directions, and neither fully recognized how much ground they were losing. The first missed dinner seemed harmless. Linda had spent most of the afternoon preparing a meal at home. Nothing elaborate, just something she knew Kelvin enjoyed. She even lit a few candles on the dining table. Not because it was a special occasion, because she missed him. The week had been busy. They hadn't spent much quality time together. She wanted one quiet evening, one uninterrupted meal, one conversation that wasn't squeezed between work obligations. Around 6 o'clock, she checked her phone. No message. At 6:30, she smiled to herself. Traffic was probably bad. By 7, she started wondering. At 7:15, her phone finally buzzed. "Kelvin," she answered immediately. "Hey." His voice sounded exhausted. "I'm sorry." Her smile faded slightly. "What happened?" "I'm still at work." Linda looked toward the dining table. The candles remained lit. Dinner remained untouched. "Oh, I know. I understand." And she genuinely tried to. Kelvin wasn't avoiding her. He wasn't being careless on purpose. He was dealing with a problem that required immediate attention. Neither argued. Neither raised their voice. They ended the call politely. Yet after hanging up, Linda sat alone at the table for several minutes. The empty chair across from her seemed louder than usual. When Kelvin finally came home later that night, she greeted him warmly. The evening moved forward. Life continued. The disappointment seemed minor. At least, that's what both of them believed. The problem was that similar moments kept happening. Not every day, not every week, just often enough to leave marks. Small marks, invisible marks. The kind people don't notice until they accumulate. A few weeks later, Linda purchased tickets for an event she thought they would enjoy together. She planned everything in advance, cleared her schedule, made arrangements, spent days looking forward to it. The event wasn't important. The time together was. The morning arrived. Everything seemed fine. Then Kelvin received a phone call. One phone call. One unexpected issue. One situation demanding immediate attention. Linda watched him listen, watched his expression change, watched disappointment appear before he even spoke. She already knew what was coming. "Please don't tell me." Kelvin rubbed his forehead. "I have to go." For several seconds, neither spoke. Linda looked down, nodded once. "Okay." The answer sounded calm, too calm. Kelvin recognized it immediately. "Linda, it's fine." "No, it isn't." She forced a small smile. "Go handle what you need to handle." The words were supportive. The sadness behind them was impossible to miss. Kelvin felt guilty the entire day. Linda felt disappointed the entire day. Neither wanted the other to feel that way. Yet both did. Months earlier, they would have talked about it openly. Now the conversations were becoming shorter, more cautious, less honest. Not because either person intended to hide their feelings, because they were trying to protect each other. Ironically, that protection created additional distance. The pattern continued. A forgotten dinner plan, a delayed date night, a weekend interrupted by work. Each situation carried reasonable explanations. Each situation seemed understandable by itself. Together, however, they created frustration. One evening, Linda stood in the kitchen while Kelvin responded to emails. She wasn't angry. She was tired. Tired of competing with deadlines. Tired of competing with schedules. Tired of waiting for the version of life they kept promising themselves would arrive later. Finally, she spoke. "Can I ask you something?" Kelvin looked up. "Sure." "When does it slow down?" "What?" "The work." He sighed quietly. "I don't know." Linda nodded. "That's what you said 6 months ago." The statement wasn't hostile. That made it harder. Kelvin closed the laptop. "What do you want me to do?" Linda looked at him. For a moment she didn't answer. Because the truth wasn't simple. She didn't want him to quit. She didn't want him to fail. She didn't want him to sacrifice his career. She simply wanted her husband back. The husband who used to be emotionally present. The husband who wasn't constantly distracted. The husband who sat beside her without checking his phone every few minutes. Yet finding words for those feelings proved difficult. "I miss you." The sentence came out softly. Kelvin's expression changed. Immediately. Because he heard the pain behind it. The problem was that he interpreted it differently. Instead of hearing loneliness, he heard criticism. Instead of hearing vulnerability, he heard disappointment. That misunderstanding would become increasingly common. "I'm doing this for us." His response arrived quickly. Linda looked away. "I know." The conversation could have ended there. Maybe it should have. Instead, frustration pushed both of them further. "It feels like nothing I do is enough lately." The moment the words left Kelvin's mouth, Linda's shoulders dropped. Because now she felt misunderstood too. "That's not what I said." "I know what you're saying." "No, you don't." Silence filled the room. Not angry silence. Hurt silence. The kind that appears when two people are talking, but no longer hearing each other. Neither intended to start an argument. Yet somehow, they were standing in one. Kelvin felt unappreciated. Linda felt ignored. Both emotions were real. Both emotions mattered. And neither person knew how to bridge the gap. Eventually, the conversation ended without resolution. Not because the issue disappeared, because both were exhausted. Unfortunately, unresolved frustrations rarely stay quiet forever. They tend to return. Again and again. Different day, different situation, same underlying wound. As time passed, arguments became more frequent. Not explosive arguments, not dramatic confrontations, the kind that leave people emotionally drained afterward. One evening, the disagreement started over something completely ordinary. Laundry. Another started because of grocery shopping. Another because Kelvin forgot a commitment Linda had mentioned earlier in the week. None of those issues were actually about laundry, or groceries, or schedules. Both understood that. The real issue lived underneath. Linda wanted connection. Kelvin wanted understanding. Neither felt they were receiving enough of either. The hardest part was that neither person was wrong. Linda wasn't wrong for wanting more of her husband's attention. Kelvin wasn't wrong for feeling pressure from work. Both were carrying burdens. Both were struggling. Both were trying. Yet from inside the marriage, it became increasingly difficult to see the other person's pain. One Saturday afternoon, Kelvin returned home after a difficult week. He expected a peaceful evening. Instead, he found Linda unusually quiet. Not angry, quiet. The difference mattered. She moved through the house normally, answered questions, participated in conversation, yet something felt distant. Kelvin noticed immediately. "You okay?" Linda nodded. "Yeah." The answer sounded automatic. He knew her well enough to recognize it wasn't the full truth. Still, he didn't push. Partly because he was tired. Partly because he feared another difficult conversation. That choice seemed harmless at the time. It wasn't. Because Linda interpreted his silence differently. She thought he didn't want to know. Meanwhile, Kelvin believed he was giving her space. Two loving people. Two completely different interpretations. Neither accurate. Both painful. As the months continued, these misunderstandings multiplied. Not because either person became selfish. Not because either person stopped caring. Certainly not because either person stopped loving. The love remained. Strongly. The communication did not. And once communication begins weakening, even good intentions can become difficult to recognize. The most heartbreaking part was that neither viewed themselves as the victim. Neither viewed the other as the enemy. There was no villain in their story. No betrayal. No cruelty. No hidden agenda. Just two people carrying different fears. Linda feared losing emotional connection. Kelvin feared failing the people he loved. Both fears pushed them toward choices that slowly widened the gap between them, and neither realized how dangerous that gap was becoming. Not yet. Because the next stage of their marriage wouldn't be defined by arguments. It would be defined by something far more troubling. The silence that followed them. The arguments weren't what frightened Linda the most. Arguments, at least, meant people were still trying. Still speaking. Still reacting. Still reaching toward each other. Even if imperfectly. What frightened her was what started happening afterward. The silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not the comfortable kind that had once existed between them during long drives across Texas or quiet evenings on the couch. This silence felt different. Heavier, more distant. The kind that settled into a room and stayed there. At first, neither Kelvin nor Linda noticed how often it was happening. Life remained busy. Work remained demanding. Responsibilities continued piling up. It was easy to blame exhaustion, easy to blame schedules, easy to convince themselves that things would improve once life slowed down. The problem was that life never seemed to slow down. One evening, Kelvin arrived home after a 4-day work trip. Months earlier, Linda would have met him at the door. She would have wanted every detail. How was the trip? How was the flight? What happened? Who did you meet? What did you eat? Tell me everything. That had once been their rhythm. A natural curiosity about each other's lives. This time was different. Linda was sitting on the couch when he walked inside. She smiled warmly. She genuinely felt happy to see him. But neither moved toward the other the way they once would have. The moment wasn't cold. It simply lacked the excitement that used to come naturally. "Hey," Linda said. "Hey, how was the trip?" "Busy," she nodded. "Mine too." That was it. The conversation ended. Neither intended for it to end. Neither knew how to continue it. For several seconds, both remained in the same room while feeling strangely disconnected. The realization bothered Linda. It bothered Kelvin too. Neither spoke about it. That became another pattern. Not discussing things that mattered. Not because they didn't care. Because they no longer knew how to begin. Weeks passed. The silences grew longer. Small details stopped being shared. Linda no longer told Kelvin every story from work. Kelvin no longer described every challenge from the office. Both started filtering information. Not consciously, not maliciously. They simply stopped reaching for each other as often. One night, Linda returned home after helping coordinate a difficult community project. She felt emotionally drained. The day had been frustrating. Several families were depending on resources that remained uncertain. The pressure weighed heavily on her. Years earlier, she would have immediately told Kelvin everything. She would have sat beside him and talked through every detail. That evening, she walked into the kitchen, where he was reviewing reports on his laptop. She watched him work for a moment. His concentration never broke. His attention remained fixed on the screen. Linda quietly poured herself a glass of water. For several seconds, she considered speaking. Then she didn't. Not because she didn't want to, because she didn't want to interrupt. That thought stayed with her. I don't want to interrupt. It seemed harmless. It wasn't. Because relationships slowly weaken when people begin treating their partner like someone they shouldn't bother. Meanwhile, Kelvin was carrying similar thoughts. One afternoon he experienced a particularly difficult day at work. A problem involving transportation schedules had created significant pressure. Meetings stretched for hours. Solutions seemed temporary. The stress followed him home. As he pulled into the driveway, he considered talking to Linda about it. Part of him wanted to. Another part hesitated. He knew she was dealing with challenges of her own. Why add more? Why place additional weight on her shoulders? By the time he entered the house, he had already decided to keep most of it to himself. Again, the intention seemed loving. The result created distance. Little by little, both were removing each other from parts of their lives. Not intentionally, but consistently. The emotional intimacy that once felt effortless began fading. Physical affection changed too. Not dramatically, subtly. A missed goodnight kiss. Less hand-holding. Fewer spontaneous hugs in the kitchen. Fewer moments where one reached for the other without thinking. Neither noticed it happening in real time. Only later would they realize how much had changed. One Saturday morning, Linda was drinking coffee on the back patio. The weather was pleasant. The neighborhood felt quiet. Kelvin joined her several minutes later. For a while they sat together, neither speaking. Years earlier the silence would have felt comforting. Now it felt awkward. Both sensed it. Neither addressed it. Eventually, Kelvin checked his phone. Then, an email. Then another message. Linda looked away. The disappointment barely showed on her face. Still she felt it. Not because he intended to hurt her. Because she missed his attention. At the same time, Kelvin felt guilty. He knew he wasn't fully present. He simply didn't know how to balance everything anymore. That frustration followed him throughout the day. The marriage wasn't collapsing. Not yet, but it no longer felt as effortless as before. What made the situation particularly painful was that love still existed. Strongly. Neither questioned that. Neither wanted somebody else. Neither dreamed of leaving. The problem wasn't a lack of love. It was a growing lack of connection. And connection requires attention. Attention had become increasingly scarce. As months continued passing, another change emerged. One that Kelvin noticed before he fully understood it. Linda seemed different around other people. The observation happened gradually. A laugh here, a smile there, a level of energy he rarely saw at home anymore. The first time he noticed it, he dismissed the thought immediately. It happened during a gathering with friends. Linda was telling a story. Everyone around her laughed, including her. The joy on her face caught Kelvin's attention. Not because he disliked seeing her happy, because he realized he hadn't seen that version of her with him in a while. The realization lingered longer than he expected. Days later, he noticed something similar during a phone conversation. Linda was speaking with a friend. Kelvin passed through the room and heard her laughing. Not polite laughter, genuine laughter. The kind that arrives effortlessly. A few minutes later, she ended the call. The laughter disappeared. Nothing dramatic changed. The contrast simply stayed in his mind. Again, he tried dismissing it. Yet the observation continued repeating itself. Community events, phone calls, visits with friends, family gatherings. Linda seemed animated, engaged, alive. Then she came home and appeared quieter, more tired, less expressive. Kelvin never asked why. That decision would become important later. Instead, he started creating explanations on his own. Maybe she's happier around them. Maybe she's tired of me. Maybe I've become another obligation. The thoughts arrived quietly, so quietly, that he barely recognized them at first. After all, everyone occasionally wonders what another person is thinking. The problem begins when assumptions replace conversations. Kelvin didn't realize he was approaching that line. Not yet. One evening, Linda sat beside him while scrolling through messages on her phone. A smile crossed her face. Small, natural, almost unconscious. Kelvin noticed immediately. What's funny? Linda looked up. Oh, she laughed softly. One of my friends sent something ridiculous. What was it? She started explaining. Kelvin listened. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Nothing unusual happened. Nothing suspicious happened. Yet after she walked away, he found himself thinking about it. Why does she seem happier lately when she's talking to everyone else? The question bothered him. Not because it was true, because he believed it might be true. There is a difference. A very important difference. Unfortunately, Kelvin wasn't recognizing it. The less communication existed between them, the more space existed for interpretation. And interpretation often follows fear. Fear rarely tells accurate stories. Instead, it fills gaps, creates conclusions, builds narratives from incomplete information. Without realizing it, Kelvin was beginning to do exactly that. The dangerous part wasn't that he had doubts. The dangerous part was that he wasn't discussing them. Every unanswered question remained inside his head. Every insecurity remained inside his head. Every concern remained inside his head. Gradually, those concerns started connecting together, forming a larger picture. A picture that felt convincing. A picture that felt increasingly real, even though much of it existed only in his imagination. Meanwhile, Linda remained completely unaware. She noticed the distance. She noticed the silence. She noticed his emotional withdrawal, but she interpreted it differently. She assumed work was exhausting him. She assumed pressure was overwhelming him. She assumed he needed support. What she never considered was that Kelvin had begun quietly questioning the strength of their marriage. The tragedy was that both were afraid. Both were lonely. Both were hurting. Both still deeply loved each other. Yet neither fully understood what was happening inside the other's heart. And that misunderstanding was about to become much more serious. Because soon Kelvin would overhear a single sentence. A sentence he was never supposed to hear. A sentence he would completely misunderstand. And that misunderstanding would change everything. Kelvin didn't notice the exact moment his thinking changed. Looking back later, he wished he could identify it. A specific day, a specific conversation, a specific event. Something clear, something obvious. Instead, the change happened gradually. So gradually that he barely recognized it while it was happening. The doubts that had once appeared occasionally now visited him regularly. Not because new evidence existed, because unanswered questions had been left alone for too long. And unanswered questions have a way of growing, especially when people try answering them without the truth. One Tuesday evening, Kelvin arrived home earlier than expected. The house was quiet. For a moment, he assumed Linda wasn't home. Then he heard her voice. She was speaking on the phone from the kitchen. The conversation sounded lighthearted, comfortable, He wasn't trying to listen. In fact, he deliberately stayed near the front hallway while removing his shoes. Yet Linda's laughter carried through the house. The sound caught his attention immediately. It wasn't unusual. Linda had always been social, always maintained close relationships, always enjoyed conversations. Years earlier, hearing her laugh would have made him smile. This time, something else happened. A question surfaced. Why doesn't she laugh like that with me anymore? The thought appeared suddenly, uninvited. Kelvin frowned. Part of him recognized the unfairness of the question. Life had changed. Stress had changed. Both of them had changed. Still, the thought remained. Linda laughed again. A genuine laugh. The kind that arrives before someone has time to control it. Kelvin quietly walked toward the living room. A few minutes later, Linda ended the call and joined him. She smiled. "You're home early." "Yeah." "Good day?" "It was okay." She sat beside him. The conversation continued normally. Nothing strange happened. Nothing suspicious happened. Yet the earlier thought refused to disappear. Why did she seem so relaxed during that phone call? Why did she seem more energized afterward? The questions lingered long after the conversation ended. Over the following weeks, similar moments continued appearing. Not dramatic moments, ordinary moments. The type that most people would barely notice. One evening, Linda received a text message while they were eating dinner. She glanced down. A smile appeared. Then she returned her attention to the meal. The interaction lasted less than 5 seconds. 5 completely harmless seconds. Yet Kelvin noticed. The smile stayed in his mind. Later that night, while brushing his teeth, he found himself thinking about it again. Who texted her? What was so funny? Why did she seem happier responding to messages than sitting at dinner? The questions sounded ridiculous when he examined them carefully. He knew that. Still, he couldn't seem to stop asking them. The truth was that Kelvin wasn't reacting to the text message. He was reacting to loneliness. Unfortunately, he didn't recognize the difference. As more emotional distance developed, his perspective began shifting. The same situations that once appeared ordinary started feeling meaningful. Not because they changed, because he changed. One Saturday morning, Linda spent several hours helping organize a community event. That wasn't unusual. Community work had always been important to her. It was one of the things Kelvin admired when they first met. Years earlier, he would have been proud watching her dedicate time to helping others. This time, he experienced a different emotion. Resentment. Not toward her, toward the situation. Toward the fact that everyone seemed to receive pieces of Linda's attention, except him. He immediately felt guilty for thinking it. Linda wasn't doing anything wrong. She was helping people. The same compassionate woman she had always been. Yet guilt didn't stop the thought from returning. Throughout the event, Kelvin watched her move from conversation to conversation, listening, encouraging, helping. People naturally gravitated toward her. They always had. He remembered noticing that quality during their first meeting. Back then it felt beautiful. Now it made him feel strangely excluded. The feeling bothered him. More importantly, it confused him. Because deep down he knew Linda wasn't choosing others over him. At least, not intentionally. Yet emotions don't always listen to logic. That became increasingly obvious. One evening, they attended a gathering with several friends. The atmosphere felt relaxed. People shared stories, laughed, enjoyed each other's company. Linda seemed fully engaged. Her smile appeared more frequently than Kelvin had seen in weeks. Watching her should have made him happy. Instead, it created discomfort. A quiet discomfort he couldn't explain. At one point, she told a story that made everyone laugh, including him. Yet after the laughter faded, a troubling thought entered his mind. She seems happier here than she does at home. The observation followed him for the rest of the evening. By the time they returned home, it had grown larger, more convincing, more difficult to ignore. The dangerous thing about assumptions is that they often begin with a tiny piece of reality. Linda really was laughing. Linda really was enjoying herself. Those facts were true. The mistake happened when Kelvin started attaching meanings to those facts. Meanings that had never been confirmed. Meanings that existed only inside his head. As weeks passed, he became increasingly skilled at finding evidence supporting his fears. A smile became proof. A phone call became proof. A text message became proof. A busy schedule became proof. Every innocent moment seemed connected to the same conclusion. Linda was drifting away. The possibility frightened him so much that he avoided examining it too closely. Instead of asking questions, he watched. Instead of communicating, he observed. Instead of seeking clarity, he created theories. Those theories slowly became stories. Stories about what Linda was feeling. Stories about what she wanted. Stories about what she wasn't saying. The strangest part was that none of those stories came from Linda herself. They came entirely from Kelvin. One night he sat alone in the living room, while Linda finished work-related tasks in another room. The house felt unusually quiet. His thoughts didn't. They moved constantly, replaying conversations, analyzing expressions, searching for meaning. Eventually, he remembered something. Months earlier, Linda had mentioned feeling lonely. At the time, he interpreted the comment as frustration with his schedule. Now he wondered if it meant something more. The possibility settled heavily on his chest. What if she's already emotionally gone? The question terrified him. Yet rather than discuss it with her, he carried it alone. Every day, every week, every month. And the longer he carried it, the more real it felt. Meanwhile, Linda remained completely unaware of the stories being created inside her husband's mind. She saw stress. She saw exhaustion. She saw a man overwhelmed by work. What she didn't see was the growing collection of assumptions slowly reshaping his view of their marriage. And soon one overheard sentence would give those assumptions exactly what they needed. A foundation. Or what Kelvin believed was a foundation. A single sentence. A single misunderstanding. A single moment that would change the direction of everything. The sentence that changed everything entered Kelvin's life on an ordinary afternoon. Not during a fight. Not during a dramatic confrontation. Not during some major turning point. That was part of what made it so dangerous. Nothing about the day felt important at the time. The weather was ordinary. Work was busy. Traffic was frustrating. Life seemed to be moving through its usual routine. Yet months later, Kelvin would replay that afternoon countless times. He would replay every detail, every sound, every decision, every missed opportunity to ask a simple question. Because one question could have prevented everything that followed. The day began like most others. Kelvin spent the morning dealing with operational problems at work. Schedules, deadlines, unexpected issues. By lunchtime, he already felt mentally exhausted. The promotion that once excited him now seemed to generate endless demands. Every solution created another responsibility. Every accomplishment created another expectation. By the time he finally left the office that evening, all he wanted was a quiet night at home. Nothing complicated, nothing stressful, just peace. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed Linda's car was already there. That immediately improved his mood. They hadn't spent much meaningful time together recently. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe they could eat dinner together. Maybe they could actually talk. Not about bills, not about schedules, not about work, just talk. The thought comforted him. He entered the house and immediately heard Linda's voice. She was speaking on the phone. At first, he paid little attention. That wasn't unusual. Linda spent a significant amount of time communicating with people connected to her community outreach work. Many conversations involved families, local programs, or ongoing projects. Nothing about the situation seemed noteworthy. Kelvin placed his keys on the counter and moved toward the kitchen. Then he heard something in her voice. Stress, not anger, not frustration directed towards someone. Stress, the kind of strain that appears when a person has been carrying a burden for too long, without meaning to. He slowed his steps. Linda remained in the next room. He couldn't hear everything clearly. Only portions of the conversation. Pieces. Fragments. The kind of incomplete information that often causes problems. Unfortunately, Kelvin didn't realize that yet. He heard Linda exhale heavily. Then several seconds passed. The person on the other end of the call said something he couldn't make out. Linda responded quietly, "I know." More conversation followed. Again, he couldn't hear most of it. The words blended together. Distance and walls distorted parts of the exchange. Kelvin continued placing things away while listening absent-mindedly. Then he heard the sentence that would follow him for weeks. The sentence that would eventually convince him his marriage was ending. Linda sighed, a tired sigh. Then she said, "Sometimes I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this." The moment the words reached him, Kelvin froze. Completely. His hand stopped moving. His breathing slowed. Every other sound seemed to disappear. For several seconds he simply stood there, listening, waiting, expecting clarification, expecting context, expecting something. Instead he heard only fragments, pieces that didn't explain anything. The conversation continued, but he couldn't fully hear it anymore. Not because the volume changed, because his attention had locked onto a single sentence. "Sometimes I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this." The words repeated inside his mind immediately. Again, again, again. He remained standing in the kitchen for several moments. Part of him wanted to walk into the room and ask what she meant. Part of him wanted to say, "Doing what? What's wrong? Talk to me. Tell me what's happening." Those would have been reasonable questions. Simple questions. Questions married people ask each other every day. Yet he didn't ask them. The reason seemed logical at the time. He told himself he didn't want to interrupt. He told himself she deserved privacy. He told himself there would be another opportunity later. What he didn't realize was that fear had already begun influencing his choices. Fear rarely announces itself. It disguises itself as caution, as patience, as restraint. That afternoon, fear convinced Kelvin to remain silent, a decision he would later regret deeply. Several minutes later, Linda ended the call. She entered the kitchen carrying the same expression she often wore after difficult work discussions. Tired, thoughtful, preoccupied. Kelvin looked at her. For one brief moment, he nearly asked. The question reached the edge of his lips, then stopped. Linda smiled softly. Hey, long day?" "Yeah." "You look exhausted." He forced a small smile. "So do you." Linda laughed lightly. "Fair." The conversation moved forward. Dinner, work, household responsibilities. Ordinary topics. Ordinary exchanges. Meanwhile, the sentence remained trapped inside Kelvin's head. "Sometimes, I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this." Every time he looked at Linda, he remembered it. Every time she seemed distracted, he remembered it. Every time she appeared distant, he remembered it. Within days, the sentence had become attached to every fear he already carried. That's what made the misunderstanding so powerful. The sentence didn't create doubt. The doubt already existed. The sentence simply gave it direction. A week later, Kelvin found himself thinking about it during work. He should have been reviewing reports. Instead, his thoughts kept returning to that moment. What was she talking about? Was she talking about the marriage? Was she talking about him? Was she talking about their life together? The possibilities felt endless. Unfortunately, Kelvin never explored the most obvious possibility, that the sentence had nothing to do with him. The reason never occurred to him, because his perspective had become increasingly personal. Every concern now filtered through his fear of losing Linda. As a result, everything seemed connected to that fear. One evening, he sat in the living room, while Linda answered messages related to community work. The image immediately connected itself to the phone call. Another evening, she appeared emotionally drained after returning home. Again, his mind connected it to the phone call. A weekend passed, where she seemed quieter than usual. The sentence returned. Each new observation strengthened the interpretation he had already chosen. Not because the interpretation was correct, because it felt correct. And feelings can become incredibly convincing when left unchallenged. Days turned into weeks. The sentence became an obsession. Kelvin replayed it while driving, replayed it during meetings, replayed it before falling asleep. Sometimes he heard it exactly as Linda said it. Other times, he heard it differently, more painful, more final. His imagination supplied details that never existed. It filled gaps with assumptions, filled silence with conclusions, filled uncertainty with fear. The strangest part was that Linda had no idea any of this was happening. Not the sentence, not the interpretation, not the emotional storm growing inside her husband. As far as she knew, that phone call had been completely forgettable. One of many difficult conversations related to challenges she was managing through her outreach work. Important to her, certainly, but not life-changing, not memorable enough to revisit weeks later. For Kelvin, however, it became the center of everything, the turning point. The moment he believed he finally understood what had been happening. The moment he convinced himself he knew what Linda wasn't saying out loud. And because he believed he understood, he stopped looking for other explanations. That decision changed everything. The moment people become convinced they already know the answer, they stop asking questions. Kelvin stopped asking questions, stopped seeking clarity, stopped searching for the truth. Instead, he began preparing for what he believed was inevitable. A future without Linda. A future he didn't want. A future he thought she had already chosen. And once that belief settled inside him, it quietly started shaping every decision he made afterward. After overhearing the phone call, Kelvin's behavior didn't change overnight. That was part of what made the situation so heartbreaking. There was no dramatic announcement, no confrontation, no explosive argument, no moment where he looked at Linda and declared the marriage was over. From the outside, life continued normally. At least it appeared that way. Inside Kelvin's mind, however, something had shifted. A conclusion had taken root, and once it settled there, everything else slowly began organizing itself around that conclusion. The sentence he had overheard followed him everywhere. Sometimes he woke up thinking about it. Sometimes he carried it into work. Sometimes it surfaced during quiet moments when the house felt unusually still. The more he replayed it, the more certain he became. Not because he possessed new information, because repetition created the illusion of certainty. The thought became familiar, and familiar thoughts often feel true. Weeks passed. Linda remained unaware. She noticed stress. She noticed exhaustion. She noticed distance. But she interpreted those things through the lens she understood best. Work. Kelvin's career had demanded more and more from him over the past several years. Long hours, travel, pressure, responsibility. From Linda's perspective, those factors explained everything. She never imagined another explanation. Meanwhile, Kelvin was slowly preparing for a future he desperately hoped would never arrive. One evening, after Linda went to bed, he remained downstairs. The house sat in silence. A lamp glowed softly near the corner of the living room. His laptop rested on the coffee table. For several minutes he simply stared at the screen. Then he opened a search browser. His fingers hesitated above the keyboard. The action felt wrong, painful, almost disloyal. Yet eventually he typed the words anyway. Apartments near Dallas. The results appeared instantly. Photos, prices, floor plans, availability. Kelvin stared at the listings. His stomach tightened. The reality suddenly felt heavier. Searching made everything seem real. Up until that moment, most of his fears had remained abstract. Now, they had addresses, square footage, monthly rent, physical locations. The experience left him feeling sick. He closed the laptop, then opened it again, then closed it once more. Over the following days, he repeated the process several times. Each search felt painful. Each search felt necessary, at least according to the story he had built inside his head. If Linda was preparing to leave emotionally, then eventually she would leave physically. That was the conclusion he had reached. And if that outcome was inevitable, he wanted to be ready, prepared, protected. The irony was devastating. The man who feared losing his marriage was now quietly helping destroy it. Not intentionally, but effectively. Several nights later, Kelvin sat at the dining table reviewing financial documents, savings accounts, monthly expenses, mortgage information, retirement contributions, insurance policies. Years of shared planning spread across the table. Linda entered the room carrying a cup of tea. She paused when she saw the paperwork. Working late? Kelvin glanced up. Just organizing some things. She nodded. Anything important? No. The answer arrived too quickly. Linda accepted it without question. She trusted him. That trust made the lie feel even worse. After she left the room, Kelvin stared at the paperwork again. Every number represented years of shared effort, shared dreams, shared goals, everything they had built together. The thought of separating those pieces felt unbearable. At one point, he pushed the papers aside and buried his face in his hands. For several moments, he remained motionless. A painful realization settled over him. He didn't want any of this. Not the planning, not the preparation, not the future he was imagining. What he wanted was Linda. The same Linda he had fallen in love with years earlier. The same woman who still lived under the same roof. The same woman he shared breakfast with. The same woman he still loved. That realization hurt more than anything else, because it didn't change what he believed. He still thought she was emotionally leaving, and if she was already gone, what choice did he have? The question haunted him, day after day, week after week. Eventually, the apartment searches became more serious. He started comparing neighborhoods, commute times, rental agreements, moving expenses. The practical details distracted him from the emotional pain, at least temporarily. Whenever sadness threatened to overwhelm him, he focused on logistics. Numbers felt easier than feelings. Spreadsheets felt easier than heartbreak. Planning felt easier than uncertainty. That coping mechanism came naturally to him. It was how he had always handled problems. Find a solution. Create a plan. Move forward. The trouble was that this wasn't a business problem. It wasn't an operational challenge. It wasn't something that could be solved with organization. It was a marriage. And marriages require conversations. Conversations Kelvin wasn't having. One afternoon he found himself imagining what life would look like after the separation. The thought arrived while driving home from work. Traffic crawled slowly along the highway. His mind drifted. He imagined coming home to an apartment. No Linda waiting inside. No familiar routines. No shared meals. No conversations about their day. The image immediately filled him with sadness. He could almost feel the loneliness, the quiet, the absence. For several moments he struggled to focus on the road, because the future he imagined wasn't a future he wanted, not even close. Yet he continued preparing for it. The contradiction exhausted him. The emotional weight grew heavier with every passing week. He slept poorly, thought constantly, second-guessed everything. Some evenings he looked at Linda and felt an overwhelming urge to tell her everything. The fears, the doubts, the sentence he couldn't forget, the apartment searches, all of it. Several opportunities appeared. One night they sat together watching television. The house felt peaceful. The moment felt safe, perfect for honesty. Kelvin opened his mouth, then closed it. Fear won again. Another evening, they shared dinner together. Conversation flowed more easily than usual. For a brief moment, he considered bringing up the phone call, asking for clarification, seeking truth. Instead, he changed the subject. Again. Every missed opportunity strengthened the misunderstanding. Meanwhile, Linda continued noticing changes in him. Small changes at first, then larger ones. He seemed distracted more often, quiet more often, emotionally distant. Sometimes she caught him staring off into space. Sometimes she asked what was wrong. The answers always sounded similar. Tired, long day, just thinking. Linda believed him, not because the explanations were convincing, because they matched what she already assumed. Work. Everything pointed back to work. One evening, she sat beside him on the couch. Kelvin looked exhausted. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes. His shoulders seemed tense. His attention drifted repeatedly. Linda reached for his hand. "You okay?" Kelvin forced a smile. "Yeah." She studied him. "No, really. I'm fine." Linda squeezed his hand gently. "You've been carrying a lot lately." The comment touched him more than she realized. Because she was right. He was carrying a lot. Just not what she thought. "I'll be okay." She nodded slowly. "I know you will." Then she leaned her head against his shoulder. The simple gesture nearly broke him, because it reminded him of everything he believed he was losing. What Kelvin didn't know was that Linda had worries of her own. She saw his emotional withdrawal. She saw his fatigue. She saw his growing distance. Every sign pointed toward stress. Career stress. Burnout. Pressure. She became increasingly concerned. Not about the marriage. About him. She started trying to help in small ways. Cooking his favorite meals. Encouraging him to rest. Checking on him more frequently. Offering support whenever she could. Each gesture came from love. Unfortunately, Kelvin interpreted them differently. Part of him viewed them as kindness. Another part viewed them as guilt. The misunderstanding had grown so powerful that even genuine affection struggled to reach him. By this point, the future he imagined felt almost inevitable. Not because anything had actually happened, because he had spent months preparing himself to believe it would. And once people begin living inside a future that doesn't exist yet, they often stop seeing the present clearly. That's exactly what happened to Kelvin. The apartment searches continued. The financial planning continued. The emotional isolation continued. Most painfully of all, the silence continued. Neither realized they were standing only weeks away from the conversation that would expose the truth. Neither realized that everything Kelvin believed rested on a foundation of misunderstanding. Neither realized that one ordinary evening would soon force every assumption into the light. And when that evening arrived, Kelvin would walk into his own house believing he was preparing to leave forever, not knowing that the truth was already waiting for him on the other side of the hallway. The night arrived without any warning, no dramatic sign, no sudden realization, no feeling that destiny was about to intervene. For Kelvin, it began like any other difficult Thursday. Work had been demanding. Meetings stretched longer than expected. Problems appeared faster than solutions. By late afternoon, he felt mentally exhausted. Normally, that would have been the thing occupying his thoughts. Not tonight. Tonight, only one thought mattered. He was leaving. Not temporarily. Not for a business trip. Not for a weekend. Leaving. The decision had been growing inside him for weeks. Now it felt final. As he drove home through the evening traffic outside Dallas, his hands tightened around the steering wheel. The familiar roads looked exactly the same. The businesses along the highway looked exactly the same. Nothing around him reflected the weight of what he believed was about to happen. His entire future felt uncertain. Yet the world continued moving, as if nothing had changed. The realization felt strangely lonely. Several times during the drive, he questioned himself. Was he making a mistake? Was he moving too quickly? Should he force one final conversation? The questions appeared repeatedly. Each time, the same answer returned. What difference would it make? In his mind, Linda had already emotionally left. He wasn't ending the marriage. He was simply accepting reality. At least, that was what he kept telling himself. The explanation provided enough comfort to keep moving forward. Barely. By the time he pulled into the driveway, darkness had settled across the neighborhood. The house stood quietly beneath the porch light, a sight that had once brought him peace. Tonight it brought sadness. For several moments he remained inside the truck, engine off, hands resting on the wheel, looking at the house. Memories surfaced automatically. The day they moved in, weekend projects, holiday decorations, movie nights. Conversations that lasted until midnight. The life they built together seemed to exist in every corner of that home. A lump formed in his throat. Leaving suddenly felt harder than he expected, not because he doubted his love for Linda, because he never stopped loving her. That was the tragedy. He believed she no longer felt the same. Eventually, he stepped out of the truck. The warm Texas air greeted him. The evening felt calm, ordinary. The kind of night most people would forget. Kelvin would remember every detail for the rest of his life. As he entered the garage, his eyes immediately found the suitcase. Still hidden, still waiting, exactly where he left it. For several seconds he simply stared at it. Weeks of fear, weeks of doubt, weeks of preparation. Everything seemed concentrated inside that single object. The suitcase represented a future he didn't want, a future he believed was unavoidable. His chest tightened. Part of him wanted to grab it immediately and leave. Another part wanted to throw it away. Neither side won. Instead, he left it exactly where it was. The plan remained unchanged. Go inside, collect a few final belongings, leave later that evening. Simple. At least it was supposed to be. The moment he opened the door leading into the house, something unexpected greeted him. Laughter. Not television. Not music. People. Several voices filled the house. Warm voices. Relaxed voices. The atmosphere felt surprisingly alive. Kelvin immediately remembered something Linda had mentioned earlier that week. A small gathering. Nothing formal. A few close friends. Food. Conversation. Support. At the time, he barely paid attention. Now the memory returned. For a second, frustration appeared. The timing felt terrible. He had hoped the house would be empty, quiet, easier. Instead, people were there. The situation complicated everything. As he moved farther inside, additional sounds drifted through the hallway. Conversation, laughter, plates moving, the faint smell of food. The gathering appeared well underway. Despite everything happening inside him, Kelvin noticed how welcoming the atmosphere felt. The house reminded him of the energy Linda always brought into people's lives. Connection, community, warmth. Those qualities had always attracted others to her. The realization made him sad, because he remembered how much he once admired those same qualities. In the kitchen, several dishes sat neatly arranged. Linda had clearly spent time preparing for the evening. Everything looked inviting, comfortable. The scene felt painfully normal, painfully familiar, as though his marriage wasn't standing on the edge of collapse, as though his entire world wasn't about to change. For several moments he remained near the hallway, listening, thinking, trying to decide what to do next. Walking into the gathering seemed impossible. He couldn't imagine smiling, couldn't imagine pretending everything was fine. Not while carrying a secret large enough to destroy his entire future. The idea exhausted him, so he decided on something else. Avoid everyone. Collect what he needed. Leave quietly. No scene. No explanations. No confrontation. Just leave. The plan sounded simple, yet even as he started moving toward the staircase, doubt continued following him. Every room held memories. Every corner reminded him of Linda, the woman he believed he was losing, the woman he still loved, the woman laughing somewhere inside the living room. That laughter stopped him briefly, not because of what it meant, because of what it reminded him of. There was a time when he was the reason she laughed that way. The memory hurt more than he expected. He looked down the hallway. Part of him wanted to walk into the living room, just to see her, just to hear her voice, just to memorize one final, ordinary moment. Instead, he kept moving. The decision felt necessary. If he stopped to think too much, he wasn't sure he would leave at all. The suitcase remained hidden in the garage. The plan remained unchanged. The decision still felt final. At least it did, until the moment everything changed. Because as Kelvin moved quietly through the hallway, a single word reached his ears. His name. And the instant he heard it, every step came to a stop. The moment Kelvin heard his name, every instinct told him to keep walking. He should have gone upstairs. He should have collected the last few things he planned to take. He should have followed the plan he had spent weeks preparing. Instead, he stopped. Completely. One foot remained planted in the hallway, the other halfway through a step he never finished. His attention shifted toward the living room, toward the voices, toward the conversation he had never intended to hear. For several seconds, nobody said anything. The silence immediately captured his attention, not because silence was unusual, because this particular silence felt different. It carried emotion, the kind of pause that appears when somebody is deciding whether to reveal something personal. Kelvin remained motionless. The hallway suddenly felt smaller. The house suddenly felt quieter. Even though conversation continued inside the living room, his entire focus narrowed toward Linda's voice. One of the women spoke first. The tone sounded gentle, concerned, supportive, not gossip, not judgment, concern. That detail surprised him. For months, Kelvin had quietly convinced himself that Linda was discussing their marriage negatively with others, complaining, expressing regret, preparing for life without him. Now, the atmosphere sounded nothing like what he expected. The realization confused him. Another voice spoke softly. Kelvin couldn't hear every word, only portions. Enough to understand the subject, enough to know the conversation had become deeply personal. Then Linda answered. Her voice sounded different. Not angry, not frustrated, tired, emotionally tired. The sound immediately tightened something inside Kelvin's chest, because despite everything that had happened between them, he still knew her. He still recognized the emotions hidden beneath her words, and right now she sounded exhausted. For several moments, the conversation moved carefully. Questions, answers, encouragement, long pauses. Nobody rushed her. Nobody pressured her. The women inside the room simply listened. The way people listen when somebody finally begins talking about something they've carried for a long time. Kelvin remained frozen. Every second made it harder to leave. Part of him wanted to walk away. Part of him needed to hear more. The second part won. Again. One of the women asked a question. This time Kelvin heard it clearly. Have you told him any of this? The question hung in the air. Several seconds passed before Linda answered. No. The response came quietly. Almost immediately another question followed. Why not? Linda laughed softly. Not because anything was funny. The sound carried sadness. The kind of laugh people use when they don't know how else to respond. For several moments she didn't answer. When she finally did, her voice trembled slightly. Because I don't know how anymore. Kelvin lowered his eyes. The words hit harder than he expected, because they sounded painfully familiar. He didn't know how anymore either. That realization unsettled him. For months, he believed he was the only one feeling disconnected, the only one struggling. Now he wasn't so sure. Inside the living room, the conversation continued. One of the women spoke gently. You still love him, don't you? The question seemed to stop everything. Even the silence felt heavier afterward. Kelvin's heart pounded. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, that single question frightened him. More than apartment searches, more than imagined divorces, more than anything else. Because now, he was about to hear the answer. The answer he had spent months fearing. The answer he believed he already knew. His breathing slowed. His hands tightened. Every muscle in his body felt rigid, waiting, bracing, preparing. Linda didn't answer immediately. Several seconds passed. Long seconds. Painful seconds. Then he heard her exhale. A shaky breath. The kind that comes before honesty. When she finally spoke, her voice cracked, and every assumption Kelvin carried began trembling. I love him. The words were simple, direct, unmistakable. Kelvin closed his eyes. For a moment he thought he might have misunderstood. Maybe he heard wrong. Maybe he imagined it. Then Linda continued. I still love him. The hallway seemed to disappear. Everything else disappeared too. The house, the gathering, the plan, the suitcase. All of it faded behind those 4 words. I still love him. The statement collided with months of assumptions. Months of fear. Months of certainty. Inside the living room, Linda continued speaking. Her voice grew more emotional with every sentence. I know things haven't been good. She paused. Another shaky breath. I know we've drifted. Silence. Then... But that doesn't mean I stopped loving him. Kelvin felt something twist painfully inside his chest. Because for months, he had convinced himself of the exact opposite. One of the women reached out with another question. "What are you afraid of?" This time, Linda answered immediately. "Losing him." The response arrived so quickly that it stunned him. No hesitation, no uncertainty, just truth, raw and immediate. Losing him. Kelvin leaned slightly against the hallway wall. His legs suddenly felt weak. The woman he believed was emotionally leaving him was admitting she feared losing him. Nothing made sense anymore. Nothing matched the picture he had spent months constructing. Inside the room, Linda continued speaking. Words she'd apparently been holding back for a long time. "I miss him." Another pause. "I miss us." Her voice broke again. The emotion sounded real. Painfully real. "He works so hard." A brief silence followed. Then she added, "And I know he's carrying so much pressure." Kelvin swallowed hard. For the first time in months, he heard how she viewed him. Not as a failure, not as a burden, not as somebody she regretted marrying. She sounded worried, concerned, heartbroken. One of the women asked another question. "What keeps you holding on?" Linda laughed softly through tears. The answer came, almost immediately. "Because when I look at him, I still see the man I married." The words hit Kelvin harder than anything else. Because she wasn't talking about the version of him that existed years ago. She was talking about him now. The current version. The exhausted version. The distracted version. The distant version. She still saw him, even through all of it. For several moments, nobody spoke. The room remained quiet. A different kind of quiet. The kind that appears when truth finally enters a conversation. Kelvin stood alone in the hallway trying to process everything he had heard. His certainty was beginning to crack. Not completely. Not yet. The fear still existed. The doubt still existed. But something had changed. A door had opened. A possibility he had never considered. Maybe he was wrong. The thought terrified him, almost as much as the idea of losing her. Because if he was wrong, then months of pain had been built on misunderstanding. Months of fear. Months of distance. Months of preparation. All based on something that might not even be true. The realization left him shaken. Inside the living room, the conversation continued. And what came next would completely destroy the foundation beneath every assumption he had made. Because Linda was finally about to explain the phone call. The phone call that changed everything. The phone call Kelvin never understood. The phone call he had built an entire future around. Kelvin remained exactly where he was. The hallway wall pressed against his shoulder. The conversation continued only a short distance away. Yet emotionally, it felt as though he had been transported somewhere else entirely. Nothing inside him felt stable anymore. The certainty he had carried for months was beginning to crumble. Not completely. Not yet. But cracks were appearing. Deep cracks. Dangerous cracks. For the first time in a very long time, Kelvin found himself questioning his own conclusions. That realization alone felt overwhelming. Inside the living room, Linda quietly wiped her eyes. The emotion in her voice had already changed the atmosphere. Nobody was pretending. Nobody was avoiding difficult truths. The conversation had reached a place where honesty mattered more than comfort. One of the women spoke gently. "You've been carrying this by yourself for too long." Linda gave a small laugh. The tired kind. The kind that comes from somebody who knows the statement is true. "Maybe you know that's true." Linda sighed. "Yeah." For a few moments nobody said anything. The pause felt natural. Nobody seemed interested in rushing her. They simply allowed her to continue when she was ready. Finally, one of the women asked a question. A simple question. Yet the answer would change everything. What was the hardest moment? Linda leaned back slightly. The silence lasted several seconds. When she finally spoke, her voice softened. "There were a lot of hard moments." She paused, thinking, remembering. Then she continued. "But there was one point when I honestly thought I couldn't keep carrying everything." The sentence immediately caught Kelvin's attention. His heartbeat accelerated. Something about the wording felt familiar. Very familiar. Inside the room, Linda continued. The program was falling apart. Kelvin frowned. Program? The word barely registered. His attention sharpened instantly. One of the women nodded. The housing project? Linda nodded back. Yeah. For a moment, Kelvin simply stared into the hallway. His mind struggled to process what he had just heard. Housing project? The conversation continued. Linda spoke slowly, as if revisiting a period she would rather forget. We were losing funding. She paused. The families needed help. Another pause. Every week felt worse than the week before. Kelvin's confusion deepened. The pieces weren't fitting together. Not yet. Inside the room, Linda continued explaining. There were days I thought the entire thing would collapse. One of the women nodded sympathetically. I remember. Linda laughed quietly. You remember me calling every day. Every single day. The two women shared a brief smile. Then Linda shook her head. I was exhausted. Kelvin's breathing slowed. Something inside him was beginning to move. A realization. Still incomplete. Still forming. But moving. Linda continued speaking. I felt responsible for everybody. Another pause. The families. A pause. The volunteers. Another pause. The staff. Her voice lowered. I couldn't stop thinking about what would happen if we failed. Kelvin felt his stomach tighten. Not from fear. From recognition. Pieces were starting to connect. The sentence. The phone call. The timing. The exhaustion. The stress. Suddenly, memories he had viewed through one lens began demanding another interpretation. Inside the room, one of the women leaned forward slightly. I remember that call. Linda laughed. Oh, don't remind me. No, seriously. The woman smiled. I thought you were going to quit. Linda shook her head. I almost did. The hallway seemed to grow silent. Kelvin wasn't breathing normally anymore. Every word demanded his full attention. The woman continued. You were completely overwhelmed. Linda nodded immediately. Completely. Then she laughed softly. I still remember saying I didn't know how much longer I could keep doing it. The world stopped. Everything stopped. Every sound, every thought, every assumption, every conclusion, every plan, every fear. The sentence landed with devastating force. Not because it was new, because it wasn't. He had heard it before, months earlier, standing inside the same house, listening from another room, listening without context, listening without understanding, listening without asking. Now, the missing pieces finally arrived. Linda continued speaking. I was exhausted. A brief smile crossed her face. I honestly thought the community program was going to fail. The women around her nodded, clearly remembering, clearly understanding, clearly aware of a story Kelvin had never known existed. One woman laughed. You were calling everybody. Linda laughed too. I was desperate. You wouldn't stop working. I couldn't. The room filled with small moments of shared memory. Memories Kelvin had never been part of. Not because Linda hid them, because he never asked. That realization hit him harder than anything else. For months, he had believed that sentence referred to their marriage. For months, he believed Linda had been quietly admitting defeat. For months, he believed she was preparing herself to leave him. The truth couldn't have been more different. The sentence had nothing to do with him. Nothing. Not the marriage. Not their relationship. Not another man. Not hidden plans. Not secret conversations. Not emotional betrayal. Nothing. The entire foundation beneath his fears collapsed. Instantly. Completely. The sensation felt physical, as if the floor beneath him had disappeared. His mind rushed backward through months of memories. Every moment. Every doubt, every conclusion, every assumption, one after another. He began seeing them differently. The smiles, the text messages, the phone calls, the community work, the exhaustion, the emotional distance. Everything. Not because Linda was withdrawing from the marriage, because she was carrying burdens he barely understood. And while she was carrying those burdens, Kelvin had been quietly constructing a reality that never existed. The realization was brutal. Not because Linda had deceived him, because she hadn't. Not because somebody betrayed him, because nobody had. The pain came from understanding how wrong he had been. One of the women spoke again. "What kept you going?" Linda smiled. A real smile. The kind Kelvin hadn't heard in a long time. "Honestly? Yeah." Linda looked down briefly before answering. "My husband." Kelvin's eyes closed. The words hit him like a wave. Inside the room, Linda continued. "There were days I wanted to quit." Her voice softened. "But I'd come home and see him working." A pause. Still showing up. Another pause. Still carrying everything. The emotion returned to her voice. "And somehow that reminded me not to give up." Kelvin felt something break inside him. Not in a painful way, in a necessary way. Months of fear, months of anger, months of sadness, months of assumptions. Everything suddenly felt exposed. Every story he created, every conclusion he reached, every future he imagined. All of it rested on misunderstanding. The truth was standing only a few feet away, and it looked nothing like the version he had created. Inside the room, Linda wiped her eyes again. One of the women smiled gently. "You really love him." Linda laughed through her tears. "Obviously." The room laughed softly with her. Then Linda added something that nearly destroyed the last remaining pieces of Kelvin's certainty. "I just wish he'd let me love him." The statement carried no anger, no resentment, only sadness and longing. A woman who missed her husband. A woman who still wanted her marriage. A woman who still believed there was something worth saving. For several moments, Kelvin couldn't move. The suitcase waiting in the garage suddenly felt ridiculous. The apartment searches felt ridiculous. The financial planning felt ridiculous. The imagined future felt ridiculous. Not because the pain hadn't been real. It had, every moment of it. But the source of that pain had been wrong. Completely wrong. For the first time in months, Kelvin wasn't thinking about leaving. He wasn't thinking about apartments. He wasn't thinking about divorce. He wasn't thinking about escape. He was thinking about Linda. The real Linda. Not the version created by fear. Not the version created by assumptions. The woman sitting only a few feet away. The woman who still loved him. The woman who still believed in them. The woman he never stopped loving. Standing alone in that hallway, Kelvin felt the full weight of the truth settle over him. The marriage had never been dying because love disappeared. The marriage had been suffering because communication disappeared. That realization changed everything. And now, for the first time in months, he faced a completely different choice. Not whether to leave, whether he was brave enough to stay, whether he was brave enough to tell the truth, whether he was brave enough to fight for the woman waiting on the other side of that room, because the future he had been preparing for no longer existed. And the future standing in front of him would require something far more difficult than walking away. It would require vulnerability, honesty, and one conversation neither of them could avoid any longer. Kelvin remained frozen in the hallway long after the conversation inside the living room moved on. The voices continued. The laughter occasionally returned. The gathering remained alive. Yet Kelvin barely heard any of it. His thoughts had become too loud. For months, he believed he understood what was happening inside his marriage. For months, he believed he had finally accepted a painful reality. For months, he believed he was preparing himself for the inevitable. Now that certainty was gone, completely gone. The sensation left him feeling unsteady, as though the ground beneath him had shifted, not because the truth hurt, because the truth exposed how wrong he had been. The realization arrived in waves, one after another. Every assumption, every conclusion, every fear, every decision. He replayed them all. The phone call, the text messages, the laughter, the moments when Linda seemed distracted, the moments when she seemed tired, the moments when she seemed distant. One memory after another returned. Only now, they looked different. Painfully different. For the first time, Kelvin wasn't seeing those moments through fear. He was seeing them through truth. And truth changed everything. His chest felt tight, not from anger, not from heartbreak, from shame, deep shame. The kind that settles heavily inside a person. The kind that forces someone to confront things they would rather avoid. Kelvin slowly lowered himself onto a nearby staircase step. The movement felt automatic. His legs no longer trusted themselves. For several moments he simply sat there, head lowered, eyes fixed on the floor, trying to process everything, trying to understand how he reached this point. How had he convinced himself of something so completely? How had he spent months preparing to leave the woman he loved without having one honest conversation? The questions arrived faster than answers. Each one hurt, because every answer pointed back to him. Not Linda, not circumstances. Him, fear, pride, silence, assumptions. Those things had guided his decisions, and now he could finally see the damage. Inside the living room, conversation continued. Linda's voice occasionally drifted into the hallway. Each time he heard it, another memory surfaced. Their first road trip, their first date, the proposal, the wedding, the years when simply hearing her laugh improved his day. Those memories didn't feel distant anymore. They felt alive, close, real. And suddenly, the idea of walking away seemed impossible. Not difficult, impossible. The suitcase waiting in the garage no longer represented freedom. It represented surrender, giving up, abandoning something that still mattered, something worth fighting for. That realization struck him harder than anything else, because for the first time in months, he understood the real danger. The marriage hadn't been threatened by a lack of love. It had been threatened by two people carrying pain separately. The simplicity of that truth almost made him laugh. Months of fear, months of suffering, months of imagining the worst, and the answer had been a conversation. One conversation, a conversation neither had managed to start. Kelvin rubbed his face slowly. His hands trembled slightly. The emotional weight of the evening was finally catching up with him. The apartment searches flashed through his mind. The financial planning, the secret preparations, lies. Not lies told to Linda, lies told to himself, the stories he created, the future he imagined, the certainty he manufactured from incomplete information. Every piece of it suddenly felt unbearable. A painful memory surfaced. The evening Linda sat beside him on the couch and asked if he was okay. He remembered brushing the question aside. He remembered telling her he was fine. The memory stung, because she had been trying to reach him, trying to understand him, trying to help. And he had built another wall, another barrier, another reason not to talk. There had been so many opportunities, more than he wanted to admit, moments when honesty could have changed everything, moments when vulnerability could have prevented months of suffering, moments when one question might have saved them both. Yet he chose silence, again and again. The realization forced him to confront something uncomfortable. He had spent months blaming circumstances, work, distance, schedules, stress. Those things mattered, but they weren't the full story. The full story required him to acknowledge his own role. That part hurt, because it required humility, the kind that strips away excuses, the kind that leaves only truth. For several minutes Kelvin remained seated. The gathering continued inside the living room. Nobody knew he was there. Nobody knew he had heard everything. Nobody knew his entire world had changed. Part of him wanted to remain hidden, a little longer, a few more minutes, maybe longer, because stepping into that room meant stepping into honesty. Real honesty, the kind he had avoided for months. Once he walked into that room, there would be no hiding, no pretending. No carefully managed distance. Everything would have to come into the open. The apartment searches, the fears, the phone call, the assumptions, all of it. The thought terrified him, not because he feared Linda's reaction, because he feared the truth of his own choices. Then another thought arrived. Simple, clear, unavoidable. What if you leave now? The question hit him immediately. Not emotionally, practically. What if he stood up, walked to the garage, grabbed the suitcase, and followed the plan? The answer came instantly. He would regret it for the rest of his life. There was no uncertainty in that answer. None. Because for the first time in months, Kelvin could finally see what was actually standing in front of him. Not rejection. Not abandonment. Not a marriage beyond saving. Opportunity. Painful opportunity. A chance to tell the truth. A chance to listen. A chance to repair what fear had damaged. The realization settled over him quietly. He took a slow breath, then another. His heartbeat gradually steadied. The shame remained. The regret remained. The love remained. All of it existed together. But now another feeling had joined them. Determination. Not certainty, not confidence. Determination. The willingness to stop running. The willingness to stay. The willingness to fight for something worth saving. Kelvin slowly stood. His eyes moved toward the living room. Toward Linda. Toward the conversation. Toward the truth. For months, he had been preparing to walk away. Now he faced a different decision. A harder decision. A braver decision. The decision to walk into that room and finally tell his wife everything. For several seconds after making the decision, Kelvin didn't move. The determination was there. The choice had been made. Yet actually taking the first step felt surprisingly difficult. Walking away would have been easier. Not emotionally easier, but practically easier. Leaving required no explanation, no confession, no accountability, no vulnerability. Walking into the living room required all of those things, and more, because once he stepped into that room, he could no longer hide behind assumptions. He would have to tell the truth, the entire truth, even the parts that embarrassed him, especially those parts. Kelvin drew a slow breath, then another. Finally, he started walking. Each step felt heavier than it should have. The voices inside the living room continued. Nobody knew he was approaching. Nobody knew he had spent the last several minutes listening. Nobody knew he was carrying months of fear, regret, and guilt. The conversation inside the room softened as Kelvin reached the doorway. For a brief moment, he simply stood there, watching. Linda sat among the women gathered in the room. A few dishes remained on the coffee table. Empty glasses rested nearby. The atmosphere still felt warm, comfortable, supportive. The exact kind of environment Linda had always been able to create. Then she looked up. The moment her eyes met his, everything stopped. The room fell silent almost immediately. Linda blinked, surprised. Not alarmed, not frightened, just surprised. Clearly, she hadn't expected him home yet. For several seconds, neither spoke. The silence stretched. Kelvin felt every heartbeat, every breath, every ounce of nervousness. Then Linda smiled softly. "Hey." The greeting sounded ordinary, simple, yet it nearly broke him. Because after everything he had heard, after everything he had misunderstood, she still greeted him with warmth. Not suspicion, not resentment, warmth. "Hey." His voice came out rougher than intended. Linda immediately noticed. Her expression changed slightly, concern replacing surprise. "You okay?" The question hung in the air. Several of the women exchanged quiet looks. Nobody interrupted. Nobody rushed the moment. Kelvin glanced around the room, then back toward Linda. His throat tightened. For the first time in a very long time, he didn't want an excuse, didn't want a distraction, didn't want another unfinished conversation. "I need to talk to you." The room became completely still. Linda studied him carefully. Something in his voice told her this was serious, very serious. She slowly nodded. "Okay." For several moments, neither moved. Then one of the women stood. Another followed. Without a word, the gathering began dissolving naturally. Nobody needed instructions. Nobody needed explanations. The emotional weight in the room was obvious. The women quietly gathered their belongings, offering supportive smiles, gentle nods, respectful privacy. Within a few minutes, the house was almost silent. The front door closed. The last voices faded, and suddenly, it was just Kelvin and Linda, alone. The same house, the same marriage, A completely different moment. Linda remained seated. Kelvin remained standing. Neither seemed sure how to begin. Finally, Linda spoke first. "You're scaring me." The honesty in her voice immediately cut through the tension. Kelvin looked down briefly, then back at her. "I'm sorry." Linda frowned. "For what?" The question seemed simple. The answer wasn't. Kelvin sat down across from her. His hands remained clasped tightly together. For several seconds, he stared at the floor, searching for words, searching for courage, searching for a place to begin. Eventually, he found one. "I heard the conversation." Linda blinked. "The conversation? Tonight." Realization crossed her face. The gathering, the discussion, the things she'd shared. Understanding slowly appeared in her expression. "Oh." Neither spoke for several seconds. Then Kelvin continued. "I heard all of it." Linda looked at him quietly, not angry, not defensive, simply listening. That alone made everything harder, because she wasn't fighting him, she wasn't attacking him. She was giving him space to speak. The kind of space he should have given her months ago. Kelvin swallowed hard. Then the truth finally started coming out. Not perfectly, not smoothly. "Honestly, I thought you wanted to leave." Linda stared at him. The words seemed to catch her completely off guard. "What? I thought you were done." Confusion immediately appeared across her face. "What are you talking about?" The question carried genuine bewilderment. Not performance, not manipulation, real confusion. And that made Kelvin realize how hidden his fears had been. She truly had no idea. None. For months, he had been living inside a crisis she didn't even know existed. The realization was painful, yet necessary. Kelvin forced himself to continue. "I heard you on the phone." Linda remained silent, listening, waiting. Months of pressure pushed against his chest. At last, the sentence escaped. "You said you didn't know how much longer you could keep doing it." Understanding didn't appear immediately. Linda still looked confused. Then, suddenly, her expression changed. Recognition. Memory? Oh, the single word carried enormous meaning. Kelvin continued before courage disappeared. "I thought you were talking about us." Silence. Complete silence. Linda stared at him. For several moments, she didn't move, didn't speak, didn't react. She simply looked at him, trying to process what she had just heard. Then her eyes widened. Oh my God. The realization hit her. Fully, completely. The entire misunderstanding suddenly became visible. The distance, the withdrawal, the sadness, the tension, the silence. All of it. Pieces that never made sense before were suddenly connecting. And the look on her face made Kelvin realize something. She wasn't angry. She was heartbroken. Heartbroken that he had carried this alone. Heartbroken that she never knew. Heartbroken that neither of them had talked. Linda covered her mouth briefly, then lowered her hand. "Kelvin." Her voice cracked. "Why didn't you ask me?" The question landed softly. No accusation. No attack. Just sadness. Pure sadness. Kelvin looked away, because there was no good answer. Only the truth. "I was afraid." The admission felt small, yet it contained months of pain. Linda's eyes immediately filled with tears. Not dramatic tears. Quiet tears. The kind people shed when they finally understand what someone else has been carrying. For several moments, she couldn't speak. When she finally did, her voice barely rose above a whisper. "You thought I stopped loving you?" Kelvin nodded. The movement felt almost unbearable. Linda closed her eyes briefly. Another tear slipped down her cheek. "No." The word came immediately, without hesitation. "No." She shook her head. "No, Kelvin." More tears appeared. "I never stopped loving you." The room grew quiet again. Not awkward. Not uncomfortable. Emotional. Raw. Years of unspoken feelings finally standing in the open. Kelvin felt his own eyes burning. Months of emotional pressure had exhausted him. The walls he spent so long maintaining were beginning to collapse. "I didn't know what to think anymore." The confession left him quietly. I kept seeing things. Linda listened. The phone calls. He paused. The texts. Another pause. The distance. Linda nodded slowly. Not because she agreed. Because she understood. Finally. At last. Both of them were speaking honestly. Not defending themselves. Not trying to win. Just telling the truth. Linda wiped her eyes. Then took a slow breath. I thought you were pulling away because of work. Kelvin looked up. She laughed sadly. I kept trying to support you. Another tear appeared. I thought you were overwhelmed. Kelvin felt guilt hit him immediately. Because she had been trying. He saw it now. The meals. The questions. The concern. The small gestures. He saw all of it. Far too late. I'm sorry. The words escaped him. Genuine. Unfiltered. Linda nodded. So am I. Neither argued. Neither blamed. Neither listed mistakes. Neither tried proving who suffered more. That wasn't what the moment needed. Both already knew enough pain. What they needed was honesty. And honesty had finally arrived. For nearly 2 hours they talked. Not perfectly. Not elegantly. Honestly. They talked about loneliness, fear, distance, missed opportunities, unspoken feelings. The conversation moved slowly, sometimes interrupted by tears, sometimes interrupted by silence. Yet nobody ran from it. Nobody avoided it. For the first time in years, Kelvin and Linda stopped protecting themselves from vulnerability and started protecting their marriage with truth. By the end of the conversation, neither had all the answers. But something important had happened. The distance between them no longer felt impossible. Because for the first time in a very long time, they were finally standing on the same side of the problem. Together. The conversation didn't end when the tears stopped. In many ways, it was only beginning. The house had grown quiet. The gathering was over. The dishes remained untouched. The television never came on. Neither Kelvin nor Linda seemed interested in anything except the person sitting across from them. For years they had shared the same home, the same routines, the same life. Yet somehow they had stopped sharing their hearts. Tonight that changed, not because of a grand gesture, not because of some dramatic declaration, because two exhausted people finally decided to stop hiding. The clock continued moving. Neither paid attention. The conversation flowed naturally now, sometimes slowly, sometimes emotionally, sometimes interrupted by long silences that no longer felt uncomfortable. The silence had changed. Earlier in their marriage, silence represented distance. Tonight it represented understanding, a place where neither felt pressured to perform, neither felt pressured to pretend. For the first time in a very long time, both could simply be honest. Linda sat curled into one corner of the couch. Kelvin sat beside her, closer now, not because either planned it, because distance no longer felt necessary. The conversation drifted toward memories. The good ones first. The road trips, the restaurant, where they had their first official date, the proposal, the wedding, the countless moments that once felt ordinary and now felt precious. At one point, Linda laughed, a real laugh. The first completely relaxed laugh Kelvin had heard from her in months. You remember getting lost during that road trip? Kelvin immediately groaned. Absolutely not. Linda laughed harder. You drove in circles for nearly an hour. I was exploring. No, you don't know that. I was sitting right beside you. Kelvin shook his head. I reject your version of events. Linda laughed again. The sound filled the room. This time Kelvin smiled instead of questioning it, because now he understood something important. The laughter had never been missing. The connection had been. The realization felt surprisingly freeing. The conversation continued. One memory leading naturally into another. Stories. Embarrassing moments. Shared experiences. Pieces of a life built together. With every memory, the tension loosened a little more, not disappearing completely. Healing doesn't happen that quickly, but something was changing. Trust was beginning to return. Not the trust that one person wouldn't betray the other. That had never been the issue. The trust that both were finally willing to speak honestly. That trust mattered. Around midnight, Linda became quiet. Kelvin noticed immediately. "What?" She looked down briefly, then back at him. "I need to tell you something." The seriousness in her voice made him sit up slightly. Linda reached for his hand. The gesture surprised him, not because she had never held his hand before, because it had been a long time since either reached for the other first. The simple touch carried more meaning than either expected. She squeezed his hand gently. "I wasn't just afraid of losing our marriage." Kelvin listened. "I was afraid of losing you." The statement settled between them. Simple, direct, powerful. Linda looked away briefly before continuing. "There were days I felt like you were disappearing." Her voice remained calm, not accusing, honest. "I kept waiting for things to get better." A pause. Then months passed. Another pause. "I didn't know how to reach you anymore." The admission hurt. Not because it was unfair, because it was true. Kelvin lowered his eyes. For several moments he couldn't respond. The guilt remained. But now it felt productive rather than destructive. It wasn't pushing him away. It was teaching him. Finally he spoke. "I didn't know how to reach you either." Linda nodded slowly. The answer made sense. Because they had both been trapped inside the same problem. Two people standing, only feet apart. Both lonely, both afraid, both waiting for the other to move first. The realization seemed almost unbelievable now. Yet it was true. Around 1 a.m, the conversation shifted again. This time toward the future. Not the future Kelvin imagined while searching for apartments. A different future. A shared future. One they would have to build intentionally. Together. "What happens now?" Linda asked. Kelvin looked at her. The question deserved careful thought. For a long moment he considered the answer. Then he spoke honestly. "We stop pretending." Linda smiled faintly. "I like that." "We tell the truth." Another small smile. "Even when it's uncomfortable." Linda nodded. "Especially then." The answer made him laugh, softly, because she was right. For years, they had avoided discomfort, and in doing so, created even more of it. That lesson would stay with both of them. The conversation continued, until the darkness outside slowly began changing. Neither noticed at first. The hours passed quietly, naturally, the way they once had during the happiest years of their marriage. At some point, Linda rested her head against Kelvin's shoulder. Neither commented on it. The gesture felt too natural, too familiar, too meaningful. Kelvin gently held her hand. No dramatic speech followed. No grand declaration. The moment didn't need one. Sometimes intimacy returns through simple things. A touch, a conversation, a willingness to remain present. As the first signs of morning appeared beyond the windows, neither felt tired. Emotionally drained, yes, but lighter, much lighter. For the first time in months, the future no longer felt frightening. It felt uncertain, but hopeful. There is a difference, a very important difference. The sun was beginning to rise when Linda finally looked at him and smiled. A peaceful smile, the kind Kelvin hadn't seen in years. Not because it disappeared, because they had both become too distracted to notice it. "You know something?" "What?" Linda squeezed his hand. "I'm really glad you came home early." Kelvin laughed. "So am I." Neither mentioned the suitcase. Not yet. That conversation would come later. For now, simply being together felt enough. And for the first time in a very long time, enough truly felt like enough. Months passed. Real change didn't happen overnight. Both understood that. One emotional conversation could save a marriage. Maintaining a marriage required consistent effort afterward. Kelvin and Linda committed themselves to that effort. Not perfectly, consistently. They started attending marriage counseling. At first, Kelvin felt uncomfortable. Talking openly about emotions didn't come naturally to him. Years of habits don't disappear immediately. Still, he showed up. Again and again. Because some things are worth learning. The counseling sessions helped both understand patterns they never noticed before. Communication improved. Listening improved. Understanding improved. Most importantly, honesty improved. They stopped assuming, started asking, stopped guessing, started talking. The changes weren't dramatic. They were practical, which made them sustainable. Date nights returned, not because somebody forced them onto a calendar, because both recognized their importance. Some evenings involved fancy restaurants. Others involved simple walks. Sometimes they just sat together and talked. What mattered wasn't the activity. It was the intention, the decision to make room for each other again. Kelvin also made changes at work. Not easy changes, necessary changes. He established healthier boundaries, delegated responsibilities, protected personal time more intentionally. The career remained important. It simply stopped being the only thing receiving his attention. Linda noticed immediately. The difference wasn't perfection. The difference was presence. And presence changed everything. Meanwhile, the community program Linda fought so hard to protect finally succeeded. The project that once kept her awake at night began helping families exactly the way she had hoped. Funding stabilized. Resources expanded. Opportunities increased. Watching the success unfold brought her enormous satisfaction. What made it even more meaningful was Kelvin's involvement. Instead of remaining distant from that part of her life, he became interested, curious, supportive. He asked questions, attended events, learned about the work she cared about, not because he felt obligated, because he genuinely wanted to understand her world. The effort mattered, more than either expected. Months later, both families gathered for a large celebration. The atmosphere felt familiar, warm, joyful. The same mixture of personalities that had once amused them during the early days of their relationship. Laughter filled the gathering. Food covered tables. Conversations flowed naturally. At one point, Kelvin stood watching Linda interact with relatives, friends, and community members. The same warmth, the same energy, the same compassion. Nothing about her had changed. The realization made him smile, because the woman he thought he was losing had been there all along. The only thing missing had been understanding. A few moments later, Linda appeared beside him. "What are you smiling about?" Kelvin looked at her, then shook his head. "Nothing." Linda narrowed her eyes playfully. "That's not true," he laughed. "No, it isn't." She folded her arms. "Tell me." Kelvin took her hand. The gesture felt natural now, comfortable, like something that belonged. Then he answered honestly, "I'm just grateful." Linda's expression softened immediately. She squeezed his hand. "So am I." The moment wasn't dramatic. Nobody applauded. Nobody noticed. Yet for Kelvin, it meant everything, because gratitude had replaced fear. Hope had replaced assumptions. Connection had replaced silence. Looking back, Kelvin eventually understood something that changed the way he viewed relationships forever. The greatest threat to his marriage was never another person. It was the story he created when he stopped talking to the person he loved. Fear filled the empty spaces. Assumptions filled the empty spaces. Silence filled the empty spaces, and every one of those things distorted reality. The truth had been sitting inside the same house all along, waiting patiently for a conversation. That was the lesson, not just for Kelvin, for anyone who has ever loved somebody. Sometimes the truth that saves a relationship isn't hidden in some extraordinary moment. Sometimes it's hidden inside a conversation we finally become brave enough to have. And maybe that's the real challenge. Not finding love, not keeping love, learning how to remain honest with the people we love when life becomes difficult. Because communication doesn't just protect relationships. It keeps fear from becoming the author of our story. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever assumed something that later turned out to be completely wrong? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Mr. George Stories. Every comment, every like, and every subscription helps us bring more meaningful stories to people who need them. And until next time, take care of yourself, take care of the people you love, and never underestimate the power of one honest conversation.